thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk to you about the founding of Stonewall, because the thing about Stonewall is that everybody talks about it like it kind of sprang from the brain of Ian McKellen and Michael Cashman, and that nothing like it had come before, that it had no links to the rest of the movement. That's not true. Absolutely not true. And I want to tell you how Stonewall came about, why it was part of what people had done before, but it did a couple of things very differently, and got into hot water for them actually initially with the rest of the lesbian and gay activist community at that time. Now I'm looking around and quite a few of you are old enough to remember Section 28, but not everybody was. And I should warn you, this is going to be a slightly London-centric talk. And I've lived here for long enough now to know I get a clout round the ear if I assume London's the centre of the universe. But a lot of the activity around Section 28 went on in London and Manchester. There was a march against it in Cardiff, which I know I have some friends here who remember going on it. But there was a lot of legislative attempts in the 80s from the lesbian and gay movement, and that's what we called it at that time, to get equality legislation and to define what equality would look like. The Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone produced a document called Changing the World, which I was lucky enough to be part of producing, and that laid out what we wanted to get equality for lesbians and gay men, as most of us thought of ourselves in the movement then. There were also a number of other things. There was a Bill of Rights produced by the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which sort of sunk without trace, as indeed, bless them, did Che. There was also a national legislation for lesbian and gay rights conference, which hardly anybody remembers, in 1986, I think, or 87, which was actually a very big deal at the time. But there were huge rows at it because the straight left tried to co-opt it. And for those of you who remember the 80s, there were a number of issues in the women's movement, in the civil rights movement, in the lesbian and gay movement, where straight left groups would send, frankly, straight people in to try and move us into supporting their wider agenda rather than a lesbian and gay specific agenda. So that's in the background. There were also terrible problems with the media. And those of you who see what's happening to trans people at the moment, that's exactly what was happening to lesbians and gay men in the 80s. A non-stop onslaught in the newspapers saying, essentially turning lesbians and gay men into electoral poison, trying to discourage the Labour Party from supporting us, all kinds of stuff like that. So all of this was the background to actually a fairly vibrant lesbian and gay movement, which was becoming more and more visible, and also getting a toehold in local authorities across the UK with equalities units, or even in a few cases lesbian and gay units, actually trying to do things for the local population. And all the grants from the Greater London Council, the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, a lot of moves around the country which made us more visible and made us more attacked. Again, exactly what's happening to trans people at the moment. People said that we were a danger to children. There was a lot of fuss about what was being taught in schools. A lot of complaints about us. And this was back in the day when it was possible to sack us. We had an age of consent for men of 21. We had no rights at all in many areas that we now do. So there were all these things going on, but we were also, as I remember it, a pretty hermetically sealed bubble of a gay movement. You had activist gays, and we were all double denim and badges, basically. And then you had scene queens, who at that point were mostly clones and gay men. And then you had nice lesbians who didn't have much to do with the gay men. And then you had lots and lots of radical feminist women who absolutely didn't have anything to do with the gay men. So it was a very disunited movement, but Section 28 happened, and it kind of brought us together, and it kind of didn't. There were at least 6 major groups fighting Section 28, including the campaign to stop Section 28, something called the Organisation for Lesbian and Gay Action. Does anybody remember that now? lasted for about 1.5 years and collapsed in ignominy, but had just started when Section 28 happened, so rode on the top of that. There was the Manchester campaign, there was the arts lobby, the media lobby, Doctors Against the Clause. These were all separate groups, and there wasn't a lot of coordination. We also had a problem that most of those groups wouldn't deal with a lot of the straight world. They wouldn't talk to Tories. It was absolute anathema. A friend of mine who was on Switchboard said it was harder to come out as a Tory on Switchboard than as gay to the rest of the world at that time. And I know some of us would still think that that's the right thing, but actually it didn't help when they had an absolute majority in Parliament and they wanted to put this bill through and we wouldn't talk to them. So the only tactics we had were marching and talking to people like trade unions and part of the Labour Party that didn't think we were anathema. There was an assumption that things like marching and demonstrating would win the day, and we all remember with enormous fondness the big stunts, the abseiling and so on. But frankly, we got walked all over in terms of the legislation, and it passed, and it was horrible. And post-Section 28, there was a lot of fatigue. I mean, at least one friend of mine had a nervous breakdown from all the work they'd been doing on the section and feeling that we were stuffed. I remember going into a meeting with a member of the Labour Shadow Cabinet who'd been quite supportive otherwise around lesbian and gay rights, and he just said, look, it's passed, you'll never get it repealed, just shut up and go away and look after yourselves. I hope he's spinning in his grave. So, all of that happened, but it also brought people together, and there was a group of gay men who, frankly, went round to Ian McKellen's for lunch, got a bit drunk, and instead of sitting around a piano and singing afterwards, sat round a typewriter and typed up a "We Have Had Enough" manifesto, which was very helpful. And that is jokingly called the Limehouse Declaration Part 2 within Stonewall, because it was done in the house next door to where the SDP's Limehouse Declaration happened. Luckily, Stonewall has proved to be a little more resilient than the SDP were. But they typed up this declaration, and immediately they said, we cannot do this, you know, we don't have the connections just between ourselves. And they went out, and the first thing they did was found some lesbians, thank you very much. Which was the point where I and several other lesbians got involved. And there was this frantic period in the end of 1988, after the clause had passed, where, there is evidence of all of this in the Hall Carpenter archives in the London School of Economics, in the Bishopsgate Institute archives, and it's Stonewall's 30th anniversary this year, so you're going to be seeing quite a bit of memorabilia wandering around because we've been digging it all up. There was a sense in the minutes from those meetings, and that we had a new sense of pragmatism. We had to talk to the Tories. We had to include lesbian and gay Tories in our ranks. Actually, we couldn't find any lesbian Tories. We could find a few gay men. So it was a sense of we have to change our tactics, and it was also a sense that we didn't want to keep having the fights of being co-opted and worrying about. Every gay organisation felt it had to be democratic, but actually it wasn't democratic because it would be a small number of people who shouted the loudest who got their way over and over again. It wasn't. You need a wide mass movement of well-informed people to have a good, vibrant democracy. So we said from right at the start, this is not going to be a mass movement organisation, this is going to be a small lobbying group. It's not so small anymore, but we said this is going to be a small lobbying group, it's going to be a professional NGO, it's going to have a board of directors, and it's going to fundraise properly. And we had experience of that because, of course, Ian McKellen and Michael Cashman and some of the other people who got involved had brilliant contacts. There being an organisation called Gay Sweatshop, and a lot of lesbian and gay actors and artists come through there. And even before Stonewall appeared, they'd organised something called Before the Act, which was a big national benefit, which raised tens of thousands of pounds. So we knew that we could do that, and that was a completely different level of fundraising from anything that had happened before. We called the organisation Stonewall, and it was my kitchen table that it got called Stonewall at, and it was me that went, we're calling it Stonewall. Because what you have to remember is that in 1988, nobody knew about the Stonewall riots except gay activists. Even most LGBT people did not know about the Stonewall riots at that point. You had to be part of the activist movement to really know much about it. Hardly anybody straight had the faintest idea about it, so basically we called ourselves Stonewall because that meant that the organisation, no matter how posh it got, no matter how many suits it wore, it could never disentangle itself from the roots of our movement, which was a riot. But also, at that point, Stonewall, the average Tory MP would have just thought we were an architectural consultancy and be quite happy to say hello to us. So it wasn't in the closet, but it was kind of hiding in plain sight, to be fair, in the first couple of years. And now, of course, everybody knows about the Stonewall riots, and everybody in this country knows about Stonewall. We called ourselves the Stonewall Group because Stonewall Housing Association were deeply miffed that we'd nicked the name. I don't blame them. We agreed right from the start that we would make decisions across a wide group of us, that we would have to all agree and have cabinet responsibility. And we also formed a subcommittee. I mean, we met in some way practically every night. The early minutes show subgroups around fundraising, around getting patrons, around forming the policy, around writing manifestos, all sorts of things were going on. We agreed that we would be gender balanced, that we would be inclusive, and right from the start there were BAME people involved, and we had parity between lesbians and gay men. You have to remember, we basically, at that point in the late 80s, it was a weird movement where we said pick a side, and bisexual people were largely told choose a side. A lot of bisexual people did come in with the lesbian and gay movement, but there was also a bisexual movement. Stonewall quite early on started being openly supportive around bisexual issues, but in the late 80s, trans people were either lesbian and gay or straight. And we basically, in the late 80s, said, oh, if you're lesbian or gay trans person, then you can come in on our movement because you're lesbian or gay. But if you're a straight trans person, there's a movement over there for nice, respectable rights. And that's how the whole nonsense about whether trans people were included or not happened. And that got kind of lost in the mists of time, but that's definitely how we thought at that point. And indeed, the respectable trans movement wasn't best keen at being linked up with a lot of the madder end of as they were seen it, of the gay movement at that time. So, you know, it was an unfortunate split, which I'm glad that they've now repaired. So it did all of that, but also it did some unpopular things. It said, if we want rights, we have to take on responsibilities. And there was a terrible row when we got onto welfare rights and civil partnerships and stuff like that, because it actually meant that all those people who'd cheerfully been claiming 2 single persons allowances for years couldn't do it anymore, because if they got wed, they were treated the same as a heterosexual married couple had always been. And that went down pretty badly with some people. But Stonewall has always had an absolute bottom line equality. If they've got it, we have it. Stonewall also did very early campaigns with the military, and that was very unpopular with a lot of people. But it was very important in terms of putting a flag up around other kinds of employment as well. And I can remember being in the first time we went to, the very first time that we went to the Armed Forces Select Committee, and John Reid from the Labour front bench, who was the shadow Minister for Defence at that point, was really didn't want gays in the military at all. And he said, what about my duty of care to the young 17 and 18-year-old lads in the army? And Peter Rivas, one of the people from Stonewall, who was a dentist and never been an activist before, but he somehow ended up with us, he just said, what about your duty of care to the 17 and 18-year-old gay men in your army? And John Reid just sort of went purple in the face because nobody had ever pointed that out to him before. So we were talking to people who'd never had any of this stuff pointed out, ever, because we hadn't bothered to deal with them before. So there were the campaigns around the military. Stonewall also did international work right from the off. And by 1989, the end of 1989, start of 1990, we were going to Brussels. with the International Lesbian and Gay Association, because 3 of the founders of Stonewall were also very heavily involved in the International Lesbian and Gay Association. I was actually the Secretary General, and Peter Ashman, who was our legal person, who was writing all the legal documents for ILGA. So we went on a joint mission, and we were the first lesbian and gay group to meet with one of the European commissioners, and as a direct result of that work, we got the first document from the European Commission talking about the need for lesbians and gay men and bisexual people to have rights. And I remember Vasil Papandreou giving me a clip around the ear because we weren't representing trans people as well, so, you know, good for the European Commission at that stage. So all of that was going on, but we raised money from a big benefit event, and we spent a lot of that money on a director, and we advertised the job of the director at £20,000 per annum, and it caused havoc. Nobody had ever offered a job within the gay movement at that kind of money. We were all expected to subsist on air. And I remember one very well-known gay activist at that time writing to us and saying, give me the job, I'll take £10,000, I'll give the other £10,000 to somebody else and we'll work collectively, at which point we were. Because that wasn't how we were working, and I think it was very different to the way anybody had worked within the movement before. And we said, we want someone who has experience, has knowledge, and is worth £20,000 a year and knows it. I mean, the idea of somebody at 20,000 now being a scandal, it would be a scandal in the other direction. But there you go. So we aimed to look respectable, but also to have expertise from the movement behind us, and we took all of those earlier things around legislation and we worked from them. So we had roots in the movement. We also had lines into Parliament. There's somebody whose name is not on the founders document. He's very unsung. His name was Douglas Slater, and he worked in the office of the Leader of the House of Lords. He was a high Tory from Eton, and he was pig sick of the way that the Conservative Party was treating lesbians and gay men, and he was our advisor on everything parliamentary, and he effectively trained us in lobbying. I was great at marching and shouting and carrying a placard at that point. I had not done a fat lot of lobbying, and he taught all of us how to go in, how to influence people, and he also helped with the discussions around what our big issues were going to be, how we were going to manage those things. So we started, Matthew Parris was the most acceptable Conservative that we could find, and to be honest, probably me and my girlfriend were about at the far end on the other direction at that time. And we all worked together, and we did have quite a lot of arguments while we were putting it together, but we stuck with each other all the way through. I remember a huge row because some of the men wanted to only say that we were going for 18 as an age of consent for gay men because they thought that was achievable. And actually some of the women saying, you can't do that, you have to go for equality, you have to have the basic line of equality. We'll probably only get 18 at first, but we've got to go for 16, and that's what we did. And we stuck to it. And actually the part of the gay movement wanted us to say that there shouldn't be an age of consent, and Peter Tatchell worked very hard to try and get 14, and we knew that that was not going to wash unless it was 14 for everybody. Why should that happen? It just wasn't going to. There were also very big rows because Peter and some of the other more radical activists from my past wanted to out people, and Stonewall was very firmly not about outing people, because we knew that we had to have the confidence of people. If you're going in to talk to people in Parliament and places like that, they have to know if they can have confidential conversations with you. You need them to know that you will support them to be comfortable in the way that they want to come out, if they eventually do. And we did want everybody to come out, but we just felt it was better if they walked on their own feet to do it rather than being dragged. But that actually turned into a huge row. And one of the other things we did was we developed a good cop, bad cop relationship with outrage, which was also flourishing at that time. Started slightly after Stonewall. my girlfriend and I actually paid the rent on their first week's meeting in the London Lesbian and Gay Centre because we thought an outrage was needed, because they would frighten the horses and the politicians into coming and talking to us in Stonewall, and it worked. It really worked, I have to say. So that's how we happened. Sadly, we grew apart from outrage, partly over outing. I can remember trying to explain to Peter Tatchell that he could not out Anne Widdecombe because you can't out somebody who doesn't know themselves. Also, she would have sued the arse off him. It really wasn't going to work. But I leave you with all that, and I'm very happy to answer questions about the start of Stonewall and anything we did that I know of from the time I was there. I was with them for 3 or 4 years. And I'm now helping them with their 30th anniversary. We've been doing archive filming of the founders, and hopefully all of that will get made available this year for people to see. I look forward to being able to maybe present some of that stuff here in Cardiff as well. Of course, Stonewall Cymru came along a few years later and was absolutely brilliant. But there you go. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's William Roberts here from Untitled Chapter. Could you say something about how HIV might have influenced the movement?
HIV and its influence on the movement in the 80s, it was huge in a number of directions. I mean, for a start, I was on switchboard when HIV really, well, it was AIDS we called it then, and it was very difficult because a lot of our best activists went off to be part of HIV, and indeed in the long run I got embroiled in HIV work, but a lot of people suddenly got paid to be on the National AIDS Helpline and disappeared off switchboard. Stonewall was operating in a world where you did have otherwise respectable politicians. I mean, as mad as some of the people we have now, saying that everybody with HIV should be put on the Isle of Man or the Isle of Wight, saying that everybody should be jailed, or all kinds of really weird shit going on. And on top of that, a lot of us had friends who were dying. So it did hit the movement for 6, but again, it brought a lot of people together. It politicised a lot of particularly gay men who had not been politicised before. And it also was part of, along with Section 28, bringing lesbians and gay men together, because in the early AIDS support movement, there were a lot of lesbians supporting their gay male friends. And so I think it made quite a difference. It was horrible. I wish it hadn't happened. I certainly wish that. But actually, it did do a couple of things that were helpful in amongst the absolutely horrible multitude of things that it did and the friends we lost. Bob, go on.
Thinking back on my time in London in the 80s, it just occurred to me that Section 28 was very much a Tory response to punish the gay community for AIDS. That it was very interesting, that the anti-stuff from Thatcher around Camden Islington and the libraries and Heather has 2 mummies and all that sort of stuff, that was one part of it. But other part of it was also that we had become an anathema. You know, we'd become the guilty ones and the people that were promulgating this dreadful disease.
I think that the government of the day, and Mrs. Thatcher said to somebody subsequently that it was a bit of red meat for, I paraphrase, for the right wing. I don't think she cared. She had gay men in her personal office. But just like now, when lots of people say, well, you know, the nice trans people are fine, it's these terrible trans activists. They always say trans activists, and in those days it was always gay activists. That somehow they were out of hand and needed to be told to shut up. And that people would say, oh, I'm not anti-gay, but you're all just too militant. And so, you know, there was a kind of, we could cope with you when you were nice gays and were quiet, and we could cope with you when you could be sacked and you'd shut up and go away. But you're taking too many rights now. You're too visible, and you might look too attractive to our kids. I always loved the idea that we could convert children just by telling them about homosexuality. Like they cared. Most kids were like, yeah, and? Sorry.
I don't know if this is too early for us to talk about, but when you talk about London now and activists, what extent were you aware of what was going on with, say, Harvey Milk, the Pride flag, San Francisco, and how did that influence you, if at all? Or was that very early?
No, it absolutely influenced us. I mean, apart from the name, through the International Lesbian and Gay Association, we had close connections with the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and what became the Human Rights Commission there. And we knew already that there was a split in the US between the respectable side of the movement and the activist side of the movement, and that both of them were needed and that they both fed off each other. So that helped us be comfortable with the model that we chose for Stonewall. We always knew we were going to be more HRC than we were going to be National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, although in fact the Stonewall that you have now is quite a lot like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force was, and takes quite similar, sometimes quite radical decisions. I find it interesting that some of my contemporaries, who were actually quite supportive of Stonewall when it was founded, are now quite uncomfortable with Stonewall's stances around things like supporting the trans community, around the level of support for the BAME community. And I just think it's really weird that I really worry about people who get stuck in their political 30s and can't get past them. It's a bit like those of us who've never changed our haircuts since we were 20, hello. They've never changed their political opinions and they're completely freaked out that the movement has got away from them. And there are young people running it who've got different ideas. And I think that's bloody wonderful myself. But there you go. I'm quite happy being an old fogey. Couple more questions. Sorry, lady right at the back in the pits t-shirt. Hey. I can't hear you. Come over and yell from the...
Obviously, Stonewall was set up to fight Section 28, but I wondered what is the thing Stonewall has done that you've been most proud of? Is it ending that, or is there something else? I
can't claim responsibility for most of what Stonewall did legislatively. I am most proud of the fact that Stonewall, within about 20 years, changed this country from somewhere where gays were persecuted, prosecuted, scared to come out, and at really high levels of legal inequality, to a country where we have, saving Northern Ireland, we have primarily legal equality in most areas, not all the trans areas yet, I know, but most areas we have legal equality, and Stonewall is seen as a shining example of how to lobby a government and change laws, not just for LGBT groups, but for a lot of other causes. I don't support everything Stonewall does. I have quite healthy arguments with them about some things that they do, but actually, the GLC produced a paper that talked about changing the world. Stonewall did change the world for LGBT people in this country. It's a very general thing, but that's what I'm proud of. I'm also proud of the fact that I still get to tell them I don't agree with them sometimes, and they still cope with that.
Thank you.
You talked a bit about some of those early conversations in the founding kind of months of Stonewall. What were those conversations like around the kitchen table, around the people's kitchen tables? Were they heated? What directions did it almost go in?
My memory is that most of the meetings were either around my kitchen table and sofas, round Michael Cashman's, who lived in Morgan Street in Bow at that time, or at Ian McKellen's place. And one of the lovely things was that we'd go to Ian's, and if it was nice weather, as it began to be as we got towards, the actual launch was in May '89, so it would be 30 years this May. As we got towards that, we would go out onto his terrace, and he'd say to me, come on, let's pinch the table, let's pinch the chairs from next door. David Owen's in Bosnia again, let's nick his garden furniture. And we'd haul it all over the fence, and so we'd have enough chairs to sit around for the whole group to sit and have an argument on Ian's terrace. And every now and again, a tour boat would go by on the Thames, because he's actually on the Thames on Narrow Street, and it would boom out, and that is Ian McKellen's house, and he'd go, we'd all just carry on with the meeting. It was, a lot of people gave us real grief for having celebrities in the group, and you have to remember that at that point he was clearly a major national actor, and it became a night quite quickly within that time frame. But we also had Simon Fanshawe, who had been a comedian at that point and won the Perrier Award. We had Michael Cashman, who was a star of EastEnders. So we had that really weird... Oh, we had Pam St Clement. How many of you knew that she was a founder of Stonewall? Yeah, from EastEnders. We had that really weird cachet around that, and we used it shamelessly, completely shamelessly. And that's how we got the benefits in. You know, the Stonewall in about '94 started a series of annual galas in the Royal Albert Hall, which made a bloody fortune for them, and paid hardly anything for the people who appeared in them, because you know, it was an honour to be there, and it was an honour to hang out with those people. It was also a great showcase. It was Step's first big gig, was opening the second half of a Stonewall gala. Yep, I was, who the fuck are they? I may have been a little drunk by then. They were good galas. I remember hauling my mother out of the ladies' loo where she was comparing makeup tips with Lily Savage. Okay, time for one more question, and then we need to start moving around, I think. You. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he wants the mic.
Yeah, no. Oh. Finally deaf. Go on then.
For the future for Stonewall, what is the future looking like?
I'm really not the person to answer that, because I'm just an advisor on the side. I'm giving them some help around the historic stuff around their 30th anniversary, because I've kind of come to terms with the fact that I'm a historical artefact myself now. I'm old enough, like Bob and a few others of us here. We turn ourselves into historical artefacts. I think that the future for Stonewall, we still have Northern Ireland to sort out. The legislation work isn't completely finished. Stonewall does a lot of brilliant international work, supporting other movements who see Stonewall as a real beacon of how to do it with politicians and stuff like that. And I think that that is something that is really important. But we still have a lot of social stigma in this country. I remember conversations in ILGA with the Scandinavians who'd had equality a lot longer than we had. And they said, you know, you can get rid of the laws, but it's the social inequality and the stigma and the prejudice that you have to deal with. And we still have a very significant level of that. And in fact, we have a rising level. We have rising hate crime, rising faster against LGBT people than other communities as well. So, you know, we have plenty still to do. I hope that Stonewall keeps its focus on those right things. I can't promise you, because I'm not part of it anymore, but I can promise you that I'll be nagging them to and supporting them to, and I hope that you all will too. Thank you.